first thing I just wanted to say was, of course, to say long simmering ethnic problems assumes quite a lot, and I'm sure that with experts on the subject, they would, they would want to unpack that whole idea, because it's not. In some ways, it's not something that's sort of set in stone. Relationships between ethnic groups. I mean, at the moment, as you'll probably be aware, our president and vice president come from the two ethnic groups that were actually most notably fighting each other in 2007, 2008. But nonetheless, one has to admit that the ethnicity issues, or issues that surface in an ethnic form, let's put it like that, are very much part of the Kenyan scene. Actually, it's very often a question of land that in the end lies behind or the ethnic unrest. In other words, it's a sort of resentment of people who've maybe come into one's area and have taken land, something, of course, which goes right back to the colonial period. I mean, the British took all the best land and kicked people out and forced them to move to other places. So it's land is really a key issue. Nonetheless, yes, the Constitution, the reason we passed the new Constitution was because people were saying, well, if you'd had that Constitution, then maybe all this wouldn't have happened. So land is actually a central issue in the new Constitution. And it tries to deal with the sort of historic injustice side of things, but how far back that will go is something still to be decided. But the Constitution does provide for a looking back at what is termed historic injustice in the Constitution, and also for another source of tension, which is not necessarily ethnic, is the grabbing of land, public land, or indeed private land by others, but particularly public land. So that's one area. But not only that, it does, I think it tries to deal with the ethnic issues at a number of levels. One of those levels is, if you like, the more emotional and rhetorical level. So whereas the previous constitution just assumed, people were Kenyan and they were Kenyan and that was it, now they recognize that, number one, national unity is an important value, but at the same time, so it also is being who you are, and your ability to speak your own language, to practice your religion, to practice your culture with people from your group, your ethnic group. So those things are recognized at the level of values in the Constitution. But those values are not just rhetoric, although obviously I think they have an important rhetorical value. But they actually are things which the courts are taking seriously, and they refer to them, and they say, we're reading the Constitution in the light of these values. So things like inclusion and so on are recognized as national values. And then there are the positive rights that are recognized, like the right to practice one's religion and so on, and speak one's own language. And then there's also the recognition of the fact that there are different communities and different ways of life. And the concept particularly comes out of what they term in the Constitution marginalized communities, which means communities whose way of life, like being a pastoralist or a hunter-gatherer living in the forest and so on, has meant that people have not necessarily been fully part of society. And these people also are sort of specifically recognized and their rights recognized. And indeed, hopefully their land issues also will be recognized. So these are some of the ways in which the Constitution tries to deal with these issues. I suppose the biggest issue is a sort of pushback from those people who feel that their vested interests are affected, and that comes from politicians, naturally, and from the public servants whose, take for example, we still have a sort of a structure which Britain often put into its colonies, which was a system of administration with its apex in those days in the office of the governor, and then somebody from that office at the level of the province, and then the district, and then going right the way down to the local communities. So it was a method of centralized control, and turned into also a method of party control during after independence, and a method of knowing what was going on at the low level. So it's a form of intelligence network as well. And in Kenya, it went along with a police force that was closely linked to this structure of what was called originally native administration, because it was the system of administering the African population. And there was a separate police force essentially linked to this. That link, as far as the police, is now has been separated, and that separate police force now has its apex with the other police force. But actually, I think I read that there were more civil servants in that system than there were in the national ministries, and this was the more prestigious place to be. And yet, with a system now of devolution to lower levels of government, they've been involved in the efforts to try and maintain, or so far successful efforts, essentially to maintain that system of a pyramidal structure going up into the office, into the national government. So that's civil servants as well. Landowners, of course, are worried about the idea of losing their land if issues of historic injustice are actually properly confronted and so on. Some of those people were obviously behind the opposition to the Constitution in the first place, and they haven't given up just because the Constitution has been adopted. So that sort of positive resistance is one. Expense is another. We've set up a system of now not just a national government, 47 county governments, as we call them, and I think there was a hope when the idea was first mooted that it wouldn't necessarily be so expensive, because one had a system of local government, and what happens at the national level should be reduced, and therefore resources could go down to the lower level. But I think that's proving to be unrealistic. I do think it's turning out to be pretty expensive. But so far, I think not so easy to work out how expensive it is. And then it's a sort of revolutionary constitution in some ways. It really requires a lot of changes in people's mindset and attitudes and so on, and they're the hardest things to change. I suppose perhaps our biggest area of effort, and it was not what we fully anticipated when we set it up, has been going to court. So we've turned into a sort of law firm. We have 4, I think, qualified lawyers at the moment, and or 3 of whom who have currently practicing certificates and are able to go to court, and 1 will do so shortly. And then Yash and I have legally qualified, but not actually, myself only as an academic, but he actually would be entitled, I think, to get a practicing certificate, although I'm not sure he'll do it. So we've been actually going to court on issues of implementation of the Constitution. Usually, or most often, not so much representing an individual client, but as a friend of the court. You have, I think, the same possibility in Canada. So that we don't actually support particularly one side or the other. We actually sometimes say, well, on the one side this and on the one side the other. So we've been involved in some of the important cases on the implementation of the Constitution. But some of them also just sort of social justice cases under the Constitution. Questions of evictions of people from their homes, questions of, one case was eviction of a group of people who, throughout Nairobi, if you go there, you will see that people have rather nice nurseries beside the road, sort of road reserve areas. They were being evicted for what seemed to be no good reason, with no proper notice. And so we actually took that case on their behalf and won, and the judge said the notice was invalid. So at the moment they're still there. Some criminal cases, or cases connected with the enforcement of the criminal law. But mostly they're all involved somewhere or other which of the Constitution. Then we publish stuff, including a book that's being launched here, which is about ethnic relations and pluralism in Kenya. But also in the newspapers, we have a column, fortnightly column, which is usually contributed to by Katiba staff on constitutional issues at the moment in one of the newspapers. Longer than one usually gets in newspapers. You know, usually they say 600, 800 words. This is 1,500 words. And then we have done a few sort of working papers, and we're hoping to move more towards more interaction with more grassroots organizations, publishing small pamphlets and things which people can use and understand, or that local grassroots organizations can use for their own public sensitization, awareness programs, and so on. And then we're also involved in some training of lawyers, usually in collaboration with other organizations with links with the legal profession, and in some programs of sort of orientation for the judiciary as well. Regrettably limited, I would say. It's such a shame. Even people who expressed views for or against the Constitution at the time when it was being adopted probably didn't read it. You find sometimes people latch on to things which they see affect them. But they'll only look at one side of the argument. And we've had cases that we've been involved with the National Assembly and the Senate, the two houses of Parliament, actually going to court against each other. And to us it seemed fairly clear, and unfortunately the Supreme Court also was of the view that this was a case in which we were amicus curiae. It seemed that if they had really sat down and thought carefully about the Constitution, they wouldn't have needed to litigate it. I mean, a number of cases in which they're taking a sort of blinkered view of what affects them. There's a lot of training programs going on, not just by us. We have a Commission on the Implementation of the Constitution, which has been carrying out programs for various sectors of public decision makers at county levels, national levels, and so on. It's getting better, but people need to know a lot more about the Constitution. I mean, it's true everywhere. In fact, Kenyans as a nation are probably more aware of their Constitution than you would find in most countries. And most of them like it, but even they only know about certain bits of it. And then they get taken aback when something happens that they don't understand. And it's not surprising, let's face it. And of course, nobody made an official effort to try and educate people about what the Constitution meant, except at the time when it was being passed. And that was the committee that drafted it actually did some public education and so on. But apart from that, it was a matter of a referendum campaign with people on both two opposing sides. And I think that's been common. I know even friends in South Africa where everybody says the Constitution is very good, the process was very good, but they fell down somewhat after the event in terms of actually educating people about what this new Constitution meant, and I think that's the same with us too. So, pity. There are sort of two questions really. One is why devolution at all, and then why to the county level. And at different times in Kenya's history, I think possibly there have been different factors. My husband and I have just been to a conference in Spain in which we are doing a paper as a case study on Kenya and how constitution making links to the question of territorial divisions within the country. And at the time of independence, there were groups arguing for, some of them taking seriously, demands for actually leaving the country. Some of the Somalis, and then on the coast, and so at that point there was there were genuine tensions about the survival of the country. More recently, that seems to be less of an issue. It's been a resistance to the heavy degree of centralization under the regimes from independence onwards. That has been a really important factor. People felt that decisions were never being made where they're close enough for them to understand what those decisions were. They were all being made in Nairobi, basically. And at the local level, they were being made by, sometimes by local government, but elected local government wasn't a great success. It was very much under the thumb of the national government. Some of the members of local government were nominated from Nairobi. Local government councils could be easily sacked by the minister and so on. So it never really took off as a true centre of local government and local democracy. So people were feeling everything was being done in Nairobi. So they were saying, we want the decision-making to be closer to home. One of the things we're exploring is how far the fact that this was an issue at the time of independence and that the initial constitution was actually a constitution for a national government and provincial governments, or called regional governments, which was actually demolished within a year. But it entered Kenya's political sort of lexicon, which was, although in the Swahili word, majimbo, meaning regions. So it was part of people's conversation. So how far that influenced the way in which the structure was set up for a constitution-making process beginning at the end of the 1990s is one of the questions we're actually trying to explore. But certainly my husband, who was much more linked to it than I, his feeling is that that it was more to do with this resentment against heavy centralization. Then there's the question of what levels. We now have 47 counties. We've got 47 counties now, which is a lot. Probably too many. But there was an existing concept of the district, which was part of this system of native administration, provincial administration, the people sort of understood and they identified with. And so quite a lot of people were saying, well, we want to be making decisions at the district level. Actually, 47 counties was the number that, or districts, was the number that existed early on in Kenya's political life in the early 60s. And then after that, presidents started to create more and more of these things. So the committee that finally drafted the constitution said, we think we better stick with the ones that were legitimately created, 47 of them. And use that as the basis for a system of more localized government. Rejected the idea of having an intermediate level which would have had some of the functions and so coordinate the activities of the more local level. And that might have been a slightly less expensive model, but they felt that the counties were something that people could relate to. And certainly people do seem to be relating to them. People are talking about, even before last May, April, when the elections took place, or March when the elections took place, people were beginning to say, I come from such and such a county, and so on. So they're beginning to sort of develop a sense of that local identity and autonomy. But I think it's also for some parts of the country, they really didn't feel part of the country at all. There are numerous stories about people going to the far north or northeast and having people say, how's Kenya? Because they just didn't really feel part of the country at all. And so that was another reason for them feeling that they wanted to be part of a sort of more locally controlled system of government. I think there were, on the whole, not much fear at the time of some groups wanting to break away, or there's been some talk of that on the coast. But I think my impression is that that was not a major theme of the discussions over the Constitution. Does it in Canada? I mean, it's a very common issue, isn't it? I mean, are you? And I think there is a problem. I think one can't deny that if you start to identify, with a smaller group more, that may strengthen your sense of local identity. The Constitution hopes that, in a sense, doing that is actually a springboard for a greater sense of national unity as well. But the truth is that the units, the 47 counties, were originally based on designs drawn up by the colonial government. And the divisions were essentially on ethnic lines. Not rigidly, but that was the image, I think, that the colonial government had. So these people live here, these people live here, these people live there. So although some things have changed since then because people have moved, still most of the counties have a sort of ethnic identity, although most of them also have minorities within the county, which is one of the issues that the Constitution also tries to address by saying that county governments must make sure that the minorities within the county are properly represented and not discriminated against, and so on. But it's possible, I think, that every time you actually say, well, you do this, in a sense, as this group, you are sort of strengthening people's sense of ethnic identity. I think one important thing to bear in mind is that it has its negative and its positive side. The counties have very limited power to raise money. They're going to have most of their money from taxes raised by the national government. It's not, so it may be there's an occasional one that has real resources. But on the whole, most of them are going to feel they're rather dependent on the national system, which, so I don't think it's likely to encourage people's sense of wanting to leave the country, because I don't think that's a major issue. But it may strengthen, in some ways, some senses of identity. On the other hand, many communities are split between counties. Although you can say this county is this particular group, there will be people from that county in neighbouring counties or scattered more around the country. So I think things have moved on quite a lot since the early 1960s in that respect. Well, Kenyans, of course, includes the people, the government, and the structures. And from the perspective of government, I think they need to put in considerable effort to making sure that everybody does feel part of Kenya. In fact, I was going to say that one of the reactions, one of the reasons perhaps for having a system of devolution was that there was a positive policy in Kenya from, I think it was 1965, when the idea was that in order to develop, you had to focus on those parts of the country which had the greatest development potential. I suppose it was a trickle-down theory. So you develop this area, this part of the country because this had the potential, the resources, the people, educated people, and so on. And eventually things would spread out and benefit everybody else. But the result of this was that people really felt excluded in the more peripheral areas. And I think the Constitution is more of a commitment to more even development. And the government needs to, and the government should be to some extent forced into that, making sure that the allocation of national revenue to the counties is on the basis of need and so on, and on the principles of more even development. But that's not the only thing the government has to do. And the government has to, you've probably read that there have been major issues recently in terms of relationships between Christians and Muslims on the coast, and there's a very bad feeling in some ways at the moment about the relationship between the Muslim community and the rest of the country, made worse because of Kenya's military involvement in the south of Somalia, and then fears that this is leading to radicalization of Muslim youth on the coast. And this becomes a sort of mantra. It's without it actually being explored. What does radicalization mean? Is what is actually happening? And there seem to be inadequate skills and commitment to dealing with this in a way that enhances the Muslim community's feeling of being part of the country, and may actually lead to I think, to some quite dangerous feelings of alienation on the part of the Muslim community. So that's at the government level. But in terms of people's involvement, well, I suppose this in many ways is the sort of people's constitution. In fact, people do feel it's their constitution, and they feel perhaps that the notion of the sovereignty of the people, which is very sort of heavily built into it, actually means something. But it does mean that they have to accept everybody as being part of, equally part of the country. And again, maybe having a system of government at the more local level, in an odd way, may strengthen this sort of national sense of national unity. And it may have helped. One theory is, I don't know how far it's a hypothesis, that at the last election, which is as I said, in March last year, the fact that there wasn't violence may partly have been attributable to the fact that people were thinking, maybe it doesn't matter to us quite so much what happens at the national level, which guy becomes the national president, because we've also got a local election which matters to us, and where the people were elected actually may be more important to us. So in some ways that may change people's attitudes, not only within their local community, but to their attitudes to the nation as a whole. But these things are very subtle and hard at this stage, I think, to measure.